as we are here in Estonia, and we are very concerned what happens east from us, about what is Russia, Ukraine, what's its future and how it's related to the Baltic future as well. Therefore, we have here distinguished experts. Some of them are my very old friends, some of them are my new friends, anyway, they are friends. And the panelists are Eric Shiraev, Dr. Eric Shiraev, who is coming from United States, George Mason University. He is a political psychologist. Actually, we wrote many papers already together, so that we have this history of cooperation. He's also co-founder and the head of the CARP Research Lab, which is character assassination on the study of reputational politics. And he's also author of multiple editions in international relations, Russian politics, Russian foreign policy, cross-cultural psychology. And also we are building right now a new book on psychological warfare. And and his recent work has increasingly focused on the psychology of reputation, psychological warfare, as I mentioned, and welcome. The next guest is Edward Lucas, who is a well-known writer and security expert, coming not from United States. This was a kind of difference from United Kingdom, which is a little bit older. Well, they used to be colony of UK once. And he's a founder and director of a new think tank, which is a Baltic International Security Center. So that his expertise includes energy security, cyber security, espionage, information warfare, Russian foreign and defense policy, and it also writes to the Estonian newspapers, which is also good to mention. Then we have Timothy Carton-Bless, who is also British representative from Cambridge University. He's a senior advisor for geopolitics and Cambridge Center for Risk Studies. He's developing SAR program of work on geopolitical risk analysis, and he's also focusing on this Eastern Europe. And last but not least, we have another American expert, this is security expert, Jason J. Smart. Well, you see, we have these different generations. Well, it makes these checks and balances here, and he's has written on authoritarian system and the post-Soviet space, especially on Ukraine and Moldova, Central Asia, Russia, Latin America as well. And he also wrote for Kyiv independence, so it's related to Ukraine also quite well, and as well as the Russian foreign policy. And last but not the least, he is of course a moderator who is a well-known expert here in Estonia, Raivo Vare, who is a former minister, twice actually, in the Estonian government, but he's a business leader, statesman, expert. He knows everything. He's a very smart. Yeah, it is a pleasure. Please continue. Raivo, this floor is yours.
Thank you very much for such kind words. Actually, taking into account that I am sitting in the panel with professors who have written a lot of books and devoted their life to subjects of the research, and not definitely I can match them, but I have great privilege to talk about issues which I think they are very important for us here in border states. It's more broadly in the West, and actually for the societies of those countries involved right now in the largest war after the Second World War yet. But it takes not very long time. It also exceeds by time spent for war even that. I think that we have to talk about this democracy in the way which wasn't Churchillian way, because Trump likes quotation of Churchill, but because actually it has some merits and grounds. First quotation I like to quote is, democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And it is exactly what we've seen ourselves also even during our lifespan time. Secondly, he remarked that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And this is something which we should bear in mind, taking into account that the democratic part of the world is about to be entered by nations which have no such experience and who are jumping over certain gradual levels of development into just at once into the level which sometimes is not familiar to them very much. Here, as dinosaur of Estonian side, I would say that here in Vabamu, where we are having this conference, it's very symbolic for us. Vabamu means freedom and museum. Freedom, museum. And when we started our liberation processes, actually throughout the entirety of the history of this, even before, was about the freedom being automatically connected with the democracy. So democracy was given thing for freedom, freedom was given thing for democracy, except very, very small portion of the society. Secondly, Tiit Land, director of Tallinn Technical University, actually compared democracy and chemistry. It's very much like chemistry, because you have to mix all kind of components and you get the best outcome, but only if you know how it works. Otherwise, it can also produce explosives or all kind of substances dangerous for your life even. And the main topic of our today's panel is what happens post-war. Because this war in Ukraine will eventually ends, and it means that we have to ask ourselves also what's next. And the problem for me, from my point of view, is that very much we are looking upon this war from both sides, actually. We are looking upon this war in the way that we think that if Putin is gone, war is over, then everything will be okay. Everything will be smoothly ensured in the right direction, developments in Ukraine and Russia, and we'll live happily ever after. But actually, it's not exactly the case, probably. And we have to be frank about it and understand it perfectly. It's a process. We've seen it ourselves. It is a process. It takes time. And with those societies having less preconditions available for that, it's very, very important how it will be conducted. Ukraine has certain advantages because Ukraine is getting through the process of nation building, which is very, very interesting, but demanding, but also very fruitful process. But with Russia, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure they have nation yet even. But definitely the nation building, like we understand it, hasn't happened in Russia yet. But maybe our panelists will think differently. And what worries me is that the mindset, and we again lived through it, mindset should change. And mindset change is a big, long, and difficult process. And this mindset, which is very much still there, even in Ukraine, is in Russia, it's actually still there, even despite of everything which has happened. And this mindset is basically might makes right. And it's not a good starting position for democratization anyway. And the life by понятия, you know this term in Russian case. This life is organic for Russian society very much, unfortunately. And we know from Plato, who said that the extreme of liberty often leads directly to the extreme of tyranny, as the masses seek a protector from the chaos they created. It's a pretty possible that we will witness even such a development. And therefore, my original intention is that I asked actually all panelists to make introductory remarks, and then we will continue with the conversation, and then I will hope that we will have some time for Q&As also. Okay? Well, let's start with a good friend Edward. The reason is selfish, because Edward is one of many here, but still one of the most known locally persons who are well aware of what is going on here. He has lived here, he has worked here, he has a network, very strong network of connections here. He has knowledge about the region in general, not only Estonia, I mean, but the Baltic in general. But therefore, and he is in a rush because he has to have to leave at a certain point of time. So let's start with Edward. Ed, floor is yours.
Raivo, thanks very much for that introduction, and also for everything you did back in the early 90s, which the fruits of which have been very important for our freedom and security and democracy ever since. Just to pick up on this idea of chemistry, I actually disagree. I think that the best metaphor for healthy politics is an ecosystem, and so it's biology rather than chemistry. And a good ecosystem has self-correcting features, and a good political system has self-correcting features, and that to me is the key. And when those self-correcting features either don't exist or get broken down by accident or by design, then you have a problem. But I guess we're here to talk chiefly about the war in Russia and Ukraine. And first of all, I have a difficulty in bracketing Russia and Ukraine in the same phrase, because one is the aggressor and the other is the victim. And if Russia stops fighting, there'll be no more war, and if Ukraine stops fighting, there'll be no more Ukraine. The trauma that both sides are suffering is enormous and will have profound consequences. But I think the single most important thing that I would like you to take away from this is that our problems with Russia predate Putin, and they predate this war. Now, we don't know if Putin will outlast the war or the war will outlast Putin, but what I do believe very strongly is that our problems with Russia will outlast both the war and Putin. And there is a kind of naive delusion in some countries in the West. Sorry, anyone here from Germany? Sorry, so don't take this personally. There is a naive delusion in some countries that we're somehow going to get back to a kind of the good old days of a stable partnership between countries that believe that trade will bring them always closer, the Wandel durch Handel idea. And I just think that is wrong. What was seen as a golden age of stability and partnership was nothing of the kind. It was a kind of Potemkin illusion during which countries like Estonia were warning the West, going right back to the 90s as loudly as they could, that Russian imperialism is still alive, that the aggression takes place both above and below the military threshold. It's a problem for the Baltics right then, and it was going to be a problem for the West too. And the West didn't listen, and the result of that is that hundreds of thousands of people are dead and many hundreds of thousands of people traumatized. So please listen to the Baltics when they tell you that the problems are going to continue, possibly even intensify under whoever comes next after Putin and whatever shape Russia takes. My final point is this question of trauma. And we know from the experience of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the disruptive effect of the so-called Afghansi, There's a very good book by former British Ambassador Roderick Braithwaite, with whom I disagree on almost everything, but his book on the Afghansi is very good. And the Afghansi fed all sorts of highly destructive, corrosive social and economic forces in Russia. It led to partly to the growth of organised crime, as many of these people couldn't find a home in the regular economy. It also fueled this sort of nascent far-right extremist movement. And that's going to be true 10, 100 times more with the war veterans. And we know from also not just in the Afghansi, we know from this part of the world in the post-World War I era, including even in this country, the disruptive effect of having lots of traumatized war veterans who feel that their social and economic conditions are disgraceful given what they believe they've sacrificed for their country. And it's not only that, there's also, and looking particularly at Ukraine, there will be a tension between those who stayed and those who left, those who fought and those who didn't, those whose sacrifice is rewarded and recognized, those whose sacrifice is not rewarded, those who made a lot of money and those who haven't. And all those tensions are going to work their way out. I was talking to a Ukrainian friend the other day who said, look at France after 1945 and the way in which the trauma of Vichy lasted through decades afterwards, sometimes bubbling up to the surface, sometimes not. Now, this does not mean that I don't criticize Ukraine for this. We should all be grateful. Sorry, any Ukrainians in the audience? I normally say thank you. Oh, thank you for defending us. There's a lot of negative sentiment knocking around about Ukraine at the moment, particularly in Poland, which is, I find, extraordinarily upsetting and ungrateful. And I want to finish just by saying that when people say, oh, Ukraine is too traumatized, too big, too poor, agricultural sectors too outsized, the institutions are too weak, the corruption's too deeply rooted. Almost all of this was said about Poland in the early 90s, often by French, Germans, Italians, sometimes even Brits. And it was disgraceful then when it was said about Poland, and it's disgraceful now when it's said about Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Sorry, I'm thinking about Eric already. Ed, I'm going to have some questions to you, but later on. It's okay? Yes, sure. You have time. Okay, Eric.
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
To connect 3 or 4 subjects of today's discussion, it's Russia, war, Ukraine, peace, democracy, US. It's a challenge, of course. I'll start with a brief intro. 3 empirical cases, done, and then we'll discuss. Well, brief intro. That's we ran in my lab, which is a small one, but we study political psychology of human behavior. Very small experiment, we call it cab driver phenomenon. And I asked my graduate students basically it's to do the following: engaged in conversation with a cab driver somewhere in a foreign capital, and begin with a conversation. Look, I love your capital, I love your country. People are so kind. Your city is so clean. Cab drivers usually say, no, well, it's a little bit dirty. People are not really kind. But now start with the opposite. I'm glad I'm done. I hate your capital city. I hate the dirty streets, homeless people. Look what cab drivers say to you. So you just pray that you not kick you out of a cab. So we become defensive when somebody else begins to pick our brains and criticize our family. So notice, all speakers, if not all of us, represent US or UK, right? So, and when we talk about deficiencies of our democracy, when we talk about ills of our democracy, we have this, masochistic pleasure. We can talk about our family. But when others begin to say, well, just look at that, we become a little bit defensive. It's a natural response of individuals because we can talk about our family, we can criticize, but please just be careful. So, as if I come to Tartu in Tallinn and say, look, in Tallinn, I haven't seen any Tesla. In Palo Alto, there are more Teslas than people. And they're completely green in Tallinn show me, and you say, wow, professor, well, how about hybrids and how about other e-car? You become defensive, right? So that's why when you begin to ask questions, discuss, make statements, don't start with, well, we know Trump is an idiot. Say, oh, your democracy is great. However, you have some hiccups and some idiots in the office. Well, anyway. 3 empirical studies. How do we connect political psychology and what we do in character? And we basically analyze words. And I'll begin with 3 short empirical cases. And one is involve prepositions. Prepositions? Prepositions? Yeah. Those of you who speak Ukrainian or Russian, you know that a preposition basically just, it's in, at, on, off, and others, basically. Prepositions indicate location and place and also possession. So when we say, basically, those speak Russian Ukrainian, in Ukraine, in English, in Ukraine, but in Russian Ukrainian, you say в Украине or на Украине. So what's the difference? Substantial. Those who support Ukraine, those who wish Ukraine win in this battle. So notice, we say if you speak Russian Ukrainian, в Украине, notice that. And you're a blogger, you know what it is. Well, they, on the other side, deliberately say na. So what's the point of that? So when we just, it's simple analysis. When you run statements by bots on blogs or individuals online and try to figure out which side are they on, so regardless of the political statement, sometimes they masquerade basically just as was a few years ago. The simple analysis shows that which bot is Ukrainian bot and which bot is Russian bot by using this very simple preposition. It's just a semantics, just basically dot in of who cares, but it has very important political weight. Second, words, and we study words, and basically we study how words are used in diplomacy and in political communication to insult people's character. I'll read you some words and about certain presidents, and just listen. Don't have to be very careful, but just a few words. Listen. Quotes from the media. President, traitor, a fascist, a would-be dictator, treason, arrogant, pompous, and distasteful, uncooperative, difficult to root with foreign leaders, most narcissistic and grandiose, provoke foreign allies in every opportunity, withdrew our country from major security alliance. President Charles de Gaulle. France, vive la France. Yeah? The point is that those words have been used in history countless times with countless presidents, countless prime ministers. And what we say and think about Trump has been done before on multiple levels in multiple countries. multiple countries. So we study ancient Rome history, we study Greek history, we study, Middle Ages, we study modern times. Basically, the same pattern exists and just, again. So we ran several studies and to see the vocabulary of Russian political establishment, what kind of words they use to describe U.S.-Russian relations and Western leaders. And basically, we see a significant increase in incivility and derogatory and offensive language beginning late teens and beginning 1920s, in particular after 2024, beginning of the aggressive war against Ukraine. Just by analyzing this offensive language, we see not only political elites, but also general political discourse. Ordinary people, media definitely, they pick up the language and multiply. And this significant growth in civility is quite noticeable. We ran multiple regressions to see the statements of Medvedev and Putin and other henchmen of Kremlin, and then the language used by social media in Russia. And there's a strong correlation, just a sustained correlation, because what they say is repeated and multiplied on the level. So it's significant growth of incivility in their political discourse. This is, again, these are valuable data and also allows us to somehow measure public opinion without going just digging into the public opinion studies. And finally, in terms of the future and possibilities. Simple test, it just was done. We did coding, and just very simple, just specifically for this forum, not for peer-reviewed journal, because this will pick us apart easily. Three key journals in the United States is Foreign Affairs, the National Interest, and Foreign Policy. They're different, some more sophisticated, some more on the right, just out in the center, more public-oriented, more professional-oriented. Overall, 1 year, we selected 69 articles in those very popular foreign policy magazines in the United States in English. 69 articles from January 1st to January 1st of this year, in which they analyzed Ukraine and Russia. And we chose 3 criteria. Basically, one is that Russia slowly and surely will transform into democracy, but it will be painful, long process, but it will. Second option, things will not change for a long, long period. And third, things get significantly worse. So 69 articles, and this is it's not very simple analysis, but basically it's very quick. Now AI does it within seconds, but the point is to give right algorithm. So 91% of articles anticipated prolonged authoritarian country. Just nothing will change and things will remain the same. Only 2 articles anticipated worsening, and 3 articles suggested that will be some sort of maybe transition. So vast majority of American scholars who publish in those journals, and they're established scholars. They're not just people who just render their opinion randomly. Well, they're really, really pessimistic about the future. Russia, basically, as will probably Jason Smart will say that about the idea that, unfortunately, may say that we have to just check our hope maybe somewhere in wardrobe and wait and contain policies, continue policy of containment. But this is a policy advice. I don't here to render any political advice, basically saying about empirical studies. So by studying words, by studying studying character attacks, by studying reputational damages, we can measure public opinion and contribute a little bit to study of public opinion and make some humble forecasts about the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Jason, I've heard you're a student of Eric, is correct? So you shall continue, obviously. You have dealt with character issues also, but it's also about the region in general, about being attached to Ukrainian soil. You have some ideas about Ukraine particularly as well. But you have dealt with the former Soviet so-called republics on broader sense. Probably you have this broader view also, not just Russia, but also others around Russia.
Sure, absolutely. And when I was looking at this issue of what happens in the long term, how does it change after the war, and what will be the conditions for change, there's something that I think is particularly interesting, which is how we analyze exactly the situation of Russia and the situation of Ukraine. And I'll start with Russia just because it's, I think, the most immediate. So when we look at Russia, we look at what's going on currently, and we look at something like sanctions, the implications of these sanctions, what it means for the country. And the reality is, it doesn't seem to change things. According to the United Kingdom, there's been, obviously, after the sanctions went on, about $450 billion of war funds were denied the Russians. According to Latvia, $130 billion of restricted goods had to go through alternative routes. That is, they had to pay $130 billion of excess to that. But in the end of the day, we see for Russia, that has not worked out to a loss. Yes, in getting the immediate good, it might have made it more restrictive. But for the elites, it was a positive. Because now there's a black market. The scarcity that was created a black market, and that created a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper then gains from that. For the people in Putin's own circle, that turned out to be a positive. When we break down who these people are within the inner circle and how they gain, we see in the case of Russia, for instance, today, every single day of the week, they're spending $22 million a day on just recruitment bonuses. That works out to $8 billion a year. And you would think that's a lot of money. So obviously the population is not very excited to go join the military. And in fact, they've had 1.4 million casualties so far. But that seems like a lot of money. But then you look at how much the elites have made in the same period of time. When the war began, the total amount of the billionaire wealth in Russia was $353 billion. Today, it's $695 billion. We see that the elites close to Vladimir Putin directly, specifically, have gained 6 times more wealth than the other billionaires in Russia. We look specifically at those who are working in industries that are being supported by the state. So we see that Russia has lost more tanks than NATO countries have tanks combined. You think it's a lot of tanks are getting destroyed. But then you look at the number of contracts we're given to build new tanks, and who has gained from that economically. There's a huge amount of wealth that is gained from that. When you look at something like the different people are being appointed to top positions in the Russian government today. Vladimir Putin has said they have about 24 relatives that are currently in state-leaked roles. A lot of them are regarding the oil and gas industry. But look at his cousin's daughter, Anya. She's a deputy defense minister. About 40% of the country's budget goes through her hands. Her husband, who happens to be, of course, the energy minister, 23% of the state's income goes through his hands. These are his own relatives. They're having the money passed through their hands. Whatever is going on, including sanctions that's creating a black market, that's a benefit. When the ports, like we've seen now, that ports are taken over by one of the security services, no longer the transportation ministry, but the fact that it's taken over by that, there are people within the security infrastructure today who are making money from that, a significant amount of money from that. When you see the shadow fleet, that's a huge amount of money, not just for the Russian state, but for those within the criminal structure there, they make money. It's a benefit. So not everything that we would view to be a loss, like the loss of soldiers, well, that creates a bloody shirt. That creates a justification for continuing the war. You can't just quit now after you've lost this many soldiers. You have to continue until you have victory. But is their interest really victory or the welfare of the Russian soldier? Of course, it's ultimately not. It's really about trying to preserve the state and preserve their own interest. So when the more you look at the numbers, I think it comes to a conclusion of what will happen next to Ukraine relates to what happens next to Russia. As long as something like sanctions are necessary, they're positive, they're good, but that might deny them the ability to immediately get a good or a service or something like this. But in the long term, as long as the elites are not being pursued fully, they don't feel a personal risk in the war, they are not taking a direct loss to it, nothing changes. Yep. Look how we've seen things change in the recent past once Ukraine has been able to strike within Russia. Things were sort of status quo. Ukraine was losing territory. What happened? In the month of May, Russia lost 7 times more territory than it gained. Within Russia, tens of billions of dollars went up in flames. Is that going to change things? Yes, that provides a paradigm shift. That paradigm shift is that now it's no longer about fighting the war inside Ukraine. It's fighting the war in the territory of Russia. And it's making it impossible for Russia to continue as it was, waging war in the territory of Ukraine. And more than this, I think today it's challenging the Putin regime's ability to continue its stability. But as a whole, when we look at this, the most important thing is going to be what happens next with the elites in Russia. If they don't face actual consequence on a personal level, on a personal loss, then nothing will change. Russia will stay as it is. But if they have something that they are now facing severe losses, significant losses, on a personal level, at that point, I think there could be change. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Tim, British start, British finish, yeah? I think that you should also elaborate a bit this region and particular considerations about this post-war also.
Yeah, happily. We were asked to keep our comments brief, so I'm just going to say 5 things. Okay. The first one is actually about the war, because this whole discussion presumes that the fighting in Ukraine will come to an end. And I agree with that in the sense that the fighting obviously isn't going to last forever. But I think it remains to be seen exactly how the fighting will end. And I think my best guess is that the end will be ambiguous and indecisive, in the sense it'll be a kind of subsiding of the fighting without any formal agreement. Much has happened in 2014, although I don't deny it's possible, although unlikely, that Ukraine will defeat Russia, in the sense that Ukraine will achieve its wartime objectives of liberating its territory and expelling Russian forces. And it's possible, although I think pretty unlikely, that Russia will defeat Ukraine. And I think it's also possible there will be an agreement of some kind to end the fighting, but this wouldn't actually mark an end to the war itself, which will continue by other means until one side or other achieves its objectives. That is for the Ukrainians to break decisively from Russia and Russia to bring Ukraine back into its orbit. So the second point I want to make is, and you asked us to comment as Raivo, is what happens next politically in Ukraine. And I think, in almost all scenarios, I can see the following. a defiant wish to retain and consolidate Ukraine's independence by investing in defense and seeking integration with the West, some progress in political and economic reform, but at the same time the persistence of many of Ukraine's old pathologies, corruption, state capture, soft authoritarianism, combined with bitterness at Ukraine's failure to recapture the East, anger with the West for its lack of decisive support during this war, uneven reconstruction, a lack of returns by refugees, and indeed extensive emigration by Ukraine's male population once the fighting ends. Although I accept in all of this there are two key variables, one of which is the stance of Russia and how decisively it seeks to retain Ukraine within its sphere of influence. And that matters because Russia has the capacity to frustrate and complicate Ukraine's efforts to consolidate its independence and join the Western camp. And the other is the stance of the West itself, which has promised Ukraine EU membership, sometimes also NATO membership, sometimes also a security guarantee outside the framework of NATO. But I warn that no one should ever underestimate the Europeans' capacity to disappoint, particularly since Ukraine's integration, as Edward noted, runs contrary to the interests of countries such as Germany, which will want to revive relations with Russia after the fighting stops. As for Russia, and this is my third point, I think there are a range of possibilities for its domestic politics, and at this point it's really impossible to say which road Russia will take. The safest bet, of course, is just more of the same, a continuation of the Putin regime, although Putin himself has been damaged by the war, whose results fall far short of Russia's initial objective of bringing the whole of Ukraine back within the Russian sphere of influence. He's under attack from the nationalists, who are reluctant to accept an outcome in which Russia gains only 20% of Ukraine's territory, while the other 80% becomes more independent than before 2022. And he's under attack from liberals who object to the huge costs which Russia has paid for its limited achievements in Ukraine, namely hundreds of thousands killed, diplomatic isolation, a battered economy, and so on, which raises two other broad scenarios: the possibility that Putin somehow falls and nationalists take power, and the lesser possibility that liberals take control of government. But in all of this, I offer one caveat, which is that this really only matters in the short term, because in the longer term, what counts is not who leads Russia, but the imperatives of the Russian state, which is to prevent Ukraine from moving into the Western sphere, and indeed whether Russia is powerful enough to prevent this. All of which has implications for Estonia, and here is my fourth point. My baseline scenario is that Estonia will avoid the worst case scenario, that is a kind of Georgian or Ukrainian style invasion, which to my mind is far beyond Russia's capabilities. For one thing, the absence of a clear victory in Ukraine means Russia will have to spend the next few years expending money and time and energy on achieving its wartime goal, and will not have the resources to open up a new front in the Baltic states. But even if it did, Russia would not succeed. And one of the lessons I take from 4 years of fighting, in which Russia has taken only 20% of Ukraine, and the part that was always most amenable to Russian influence, is that Russia simply lacks the power to engage in imperial conquest, especially here in the Baltic states, in the face of a motivated, well-armed population with powerful external allies from Poland to the Nordics, the UK, Canada, and hopefully also the United States. And in this respect, the worst case scenario I see for Estonia and its neighbours is harassment, to the extent that Russia perceives them as a threat because of their support for Ukraine and their ability to mobilize NATO in opposition, which implies tactics of the kind that Russia has practiced across the former Soviet Union in recent years, from cyber attack to sabotage, violations of airspace, manipulation of internal politics, and so on. Which takes me to my fifth and final point, which is that all of this implies the need for Estonia to continue investing in its defences, to maintain the support of NATO, to sponsor Ukraine's security, to ensure that Russia remains pinned down in the country. But this does come with a proviso encapsulated in the concept of the security dilemma, which to my mind is the most important concept in all international relations, namely that one country's efforts at defence can appear as aggression to another country, increasing the risk of hostility, which doesn't mean that Estonia should abandon its defences and adopt a policy of accommodation to Russia. Absolutely not. But it does mean that the more Estonia invests in defence and supports Ukraine, the more it makes itself a target of Russia, raising the likelihood of an adverse Russian reaction. In other words, the very outcome Estonia is trying to avoid.
Thank you. Ed, you wanted to say something.
Yes, thanks very much. I think there's an expression in French which says this animal is very naughty. When it's attacked, it defends itself. And I think that there's a kind of Russian psychological operation which goes on all the time, saying it's a bit like the Incredible Hulk. Don't get me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry. And they're saying this all the time about the attempts by the countries neighbouring them to get their defences in order. And we just shouldn't fall for it. You know, Finland has the JASM missile, which is the most powerful, stealthy, long-range missile of any European country has. Poland is getting them. The Finns are the first country to get it. And they can strike, the exact range is classified, but more than 1,000 kilometres inside Russia. So the idea that Estonia is somehow provoking Russia by getting HIMARS is nonsense. That's a Russian psyop, and we shouldn't fall for it. Secondly, I get extremely nervous when I hear the word Russian liberal. I think the laughter in the audience shows that Estonians get this. I don't know any Russian liberals, really. I mean, maybe a couple, but liberals in the sense of like Estonian Reform Party members of ALDE, no. No, I mean, there are anti-Putin Russians who would like to get back to an era in which they can get rich. There's Russians who would like to be treated politely in the rest of Europe. But I'm extremely skeptical about the idea that if we get some post-Putin Potemkin, fake, phony liberals coming in, that this will be anything other than a disaster. What will happen is you'll get a tidal wave in countries like Germany of people saying, great, Mr. Kudrin is out of prison, and Mishustin is the former prime minister, or Nabulin, or one of these other people. These are the rational guys, the technocrats. No, maybe don't call them liberals. And they will play this game of saying, you have to be nice to us, drop sanctions, help us, help keep us in power, calm down those annoying, pointy-headed frontline states. Because if you don't help us, you'll get the bad guys. And boy, have we seen this movie already. We saw this movie under Gorbachev, we saw it under Yeltsin. It's a disaster. And I'm really worried. Perhaps I'm more worried about this than I am about Smuta or about full-blown fascism. Or I think I'm most worried about is that we get these so-called liberals coming in a post-Putin, supposedly technocratic regime, and then the West will then arm twist you guys to go along with the next reset. Sorry, Mike, that's not personal. It'd be a bad reset, not like your reset. But the big Western countries, desperate for cheap gas and normality, will arm twist you guys to go along with the reset. That's what I'm worried about.
Well, again, I would support your point of view from another angle. Basically, the strength in Russian perception is a different animal than it is in the Western one. and it's about domination, and it's about not compromise. That's the fundamental thing. Yeah, compromise is the fundament for any kind of solution as such, technically. But recognition of compromise as a solution is not exactly the strong side of a Russian party in any negotiations throughout the history. And that's exactly what we are witnessing still, whomever is in helm of the society. But this is my point, personal point of view. Of course, I'm wrong because I'm not professor. But my question is to add another one, which is related to trauma issue. You mentioned trauma. You compared this trauma issue with Vichy, but we are also talking about trauma in Russian society, trauma related to the breakdown of this great nation, the largest trauma of the century, yeah? Putin's words, of Soviet Union. And a lot of people still think in the same categories. And now what we are witnessing, by my understanding, we are witnessing the new generation growing up and having same ideas. For time being, medium time, the period, there were people who actually valued more different things, not nostalgic about Soviet Union. Now this nostalgia is again rising, but not in different form, not as it used to be, Soviet type, but Soviet as a great idea and new forms for that.
Yes, I, as a Brit, I'm always a bit nervous about criticising other countries that get obsessed with wartime glories that nobody else remembers, because we do that in Britain as well. But I think you're absolutely right that there's this kind of PTSD, which is we all recognise it here because it's throughout all the captive nations. The consequence of occupation, sometimes the loss of statehood, the destruction of elites, deportations and so on. And that leaves a kind of both a direct scar on the generations that experience it, but also a kind of epigenetic effect on people for whom it's the memory of their parents or grandparents or even now great-grandparents. And it's one of the reasons why people in the Baltics and in Poland reacted so strongly initially to what was happening in Bucha and other places, because they said that's just what happened to us. But we sometimes forget there's also a kind of PTSD in Russia, which is a PTSD of the victor who's been robbed of their spoils in their eyes. And that was Putin's famous statement that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the geopolitical catastrophe of the century. It was a very, very significant statement because that, for many Russians, that idea of the Velika Strana, the Derzhava, is absolutely baked in. It's part of their self-respect. And that's not just a matter of being big at home. It's also, unfortunately, a matter of being big abroad. And in the days when I was based in Russia and I used to have contacts in the Kremlin, I remember asking them, what is it you really want? And they said, well, basically in our neighbouring countries, we want nothing happens that we don't know about and nothing happens that we don't like. And that's the kind of, the soft imperial demand for the near abroad. And it's very deeply baked in. They think that it's only through that they can have their sense of national security and actually self-respect. And that's why I think this is a generational problem. Until Russia stops, or Russians have that change in mindset that you referred to, stop thinking of themselves as an empire, stop thinking that their self-respect is based on what they do to other countries, everyone here, and actually all of Europe, is going to have a problem. And I'm not sure that's going to change in my lifetime. I'm looking around the room to seeing who the younger people are here. Maybe it'll change in yours, but I'm 64 and I'm not expecting to see it.
Thank you. Gentlemen, you agree? Have notes?
Partially, but yes, we'll continue.
Okay. The second question is the idea which was a starting point for Eric's presentation about this natural defensive position which people and societies have when it is about their own. Always defensive. It's very natural, typical. Now, taking account what we have had already here on the table with Russians, how it looks for the future with Russians. They are defensive. They are defending this not so glorious actually past, but they define it as glorious one, and they defend it by all means as glorious one. But how to overcome it? What to do for it? Do you see in your research? Do you see signs that there is something going on which is helping us to overcome it? To see that they will overcome it.
If I say hopeless, it will be really unprofessional. But, well, I will refer to comments made earlier today by Professor McFall. And he said that please do not judge Americans just as Americans, because we are different. Different backgrounds, different beliefs, and different stomach acids. Right? So, like in our panel, if just basically just I'm perhaps just as you'll kick me out, but if we ask, hey guys, just if we have this magic X-ray, and it will tell us whom we voted last 5 elections, United States presidential elections, you will see that's a predominantly voting Democrat, right? Do we represent America? We are most educated. We judge the world from the comfort of our offices. We render our opinions. And 75% of American political scientists they vote Democrat. So that's why just to say about Russian people is very difficult, because we have to take who, when, and under what circumstances. And in fact, public opinion is very quantum. Quantum means that when we measure it, we create answers in the process. Basically, what studies just Rob Shapiro and just the late Richard Sobel from Chicago, basically just people have no idea, and then you ask a question, and they form the question right on the spot. So that's why you have to just basically just like the Kantian way. Don't ask questions about God, nature, religion, moral values. Ask specific questions. So under what conditions the peasants, the Moscow, citizens in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, or in some godforsaken city in Ural Mountains. So what do they think about the war, and what they get about, and how they see democracy? Democracy is a direct, well, if I can drop F-bombs here because it's impolite, we're on the record. Democracy is a bad word in Russia. Okay, so-called democracy. Your bleep, 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 liberal values, bleep, 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 end of sentence. Just they tell me, oh, just you want to, in Russia, we don't want to have your LGBT class, whatever is there. So and people who are educated with master's degrees used to tell me these things. So that's why overall my answer, unfortunately, just referring to the Bible, it takes 30, 40 years just to wait and see how things change. And just perhaps we'll say that the younger individuals in particular, they're the ones who are hopefully likely to change something. On the other hand, we see this tremendous growth of this, and I just make a correction about this. You said about post-traumatic stress disorder. Using my background, I would say probably it's a case of narcissistic disorder. Narcissistic people are fundamentally offended when they think that they'll be cheating out. I deserve to be here. I want to see just in front row in just basketball game. I'm on second. Absolutely wrong. So and this is what narcissism is, sort of a phenomenon which is difficult to grasp empirically. This is what permeates, unfortunately, Russian society today. We deserve this. We are Russians. We're a great culture. We have to have it. And that's what bothers me. That's why I say we have to wait out. However, we know that public opinion moves in mysterious ways. And nobody predicted Gorbachev, and he came, and things were different after that.
Jason, do you want to add?
You know, I don't, sorry. You know, in general, I mean, yes, Russians probably do believe that by far and large. That being said, over time, I've come to really believe this is largely something to distract the population. I mean, whether Putin personally believes this, I don't think he has any real interest in it. I really, frankly, don't. I've seen that he's murdered people for the past 26 years. His sole interest is self-enrichment for himself and his circle. It's state capture. They've totally robbed the Russian state. There's nothing. Look how the average person in Russia lives. They talk about greatness. It is something that is given to them like bread and circus. They give us an illusion of a state that's strong or could be strong. They have 1.4 million people who have died or been killed or injured in this war. The average person now that gets to the front survives for 20 to 35 minutes. There's a 2 to 3 week period from the time they sign a contract to they die in Donbass. I don't think it's really about any of this. I think this is really just a means for the masses, something they're told, something they'll buy off on. But it's not unique to them, to be fair. think about Make America Great Again, where you have this idea of this vision of the great country that you're going to help fulfill. It's going to be great. Just keep saying it's going to be great. A lot of the population will be distracted by that. They'll go along with that. They don't look further. But if your actual objective is corruption, in both cases, if that's your actual objective, then I think that's what it keeps them. This is something that you give them while you continue on doing what you're interested in, which is your own self-enrichment. And I think that's really largely what the Putin regime has been about. It's been a criminal regime that operates as such through its whole existence.
Tim, you agree? What has been said?
I think what we've heard is a partial analysis. I come out of the world of geopolitics, and I think there's a geopolitical dimension to this, which I will offer now, which is that if we're trying to understand Russia's behavior internationally, and specifically towards Baltic states and other parts of the former Soviet Union, it's worth actually reflecting on the nature of Russia's geography, because this really does offer an insight into the way it behaves internationally. And there's a great deal I could say about this, but I'll make 3 points. The first is that Russia has no defensive barriers on its western frontier.
Geographical barriers, 420 kilometers Poland and 120 kilometers down south in between Moldova and Black Sea.
Right.
So still they have non-defensible. The rest is mountains.
You have the Great Northern European plain passing through Poland, and Ukraine is essentially a flat land. I mean, the historical reality is that Russia has been invaded from its west multiple times in the past, most recently twice by Germany, also by France under Napoleon. And Russia undoubtedly feels vulnerable, and it defends itself via the concept of strategic depth. In other words, trying to control neighbors in buffer upon buffer to slow down any advancing army. You may or may not approve of that, but that's an indisputable reality and an explanation into why Russia behaves as it does. The second is about access to the sea. Russia is highly constrained, a huge country, but with very limited access to the seas. And in this respect, the Black Sea is absolutely crucial.
They have 22,480 kilometers of sea borderline.
Yeah,
of
but most of it is in the north and capped by ice. Look, I mean, it doesn't really matter what you say or I say. What matters is how the Russians perceive their geopolitical situation to be. And so access to the Black Sea is crucial in terms of their ability to project power and interact with the outside world. And that's a good part of the reason why they're obsessed with Ukraine and the status and international orientation of Ukraine. And the third is just about access to natural resources. And in this sense, maybe Russia is slow to adapt to a world in which it's possible to trade commodities without actually having to possess the place where those commodities come from. But I can see the complication from the Russian point of view. I just did a big piece of work in the last year about a company called VSMPO. It's Russia's biggest titanium producer. And VSMPO's weakness is that all the titanium that supplies the company is situated in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
And in other words, the very viability of that company depends upon the goodwill of the Ukrainians to sell it titanium. And if that goodwill is absent, then that particular industrial sector is jeopardized. So you'll notice I'm trying to avoid normative discussion here. I'm just presenting an analysis, a geopolitical analysis here. And I put this out there as to offer a fuller explanation of why Russia is behaving as it does and why I think it will continue to do so in the future, regardless of who's in power.
So basically you're claiming that the famous saying from Putin's side on one event 2015 or 16, answering the question of the child, where are borders of Russia? There is no borders of Russia, horizon. Yeah, please, Ed.
Two things. First of all, I think it's a mistake, to say that Putin's only interested in money. That essay he wrote on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine was I think all the professors here would have given it an F or whatever the equivalent is in terms of facts, structure, logic. But if you're marking for enthusiasm, you might have had to give it an A. That came from the heart. That was not written, I don't think, by someone who was just trying to find an excuse for stealing. You can argue about whether he believed this right back in the 80s and 90s and how deep this goes, whether this is a belief that's intensified over time. But I disagree. I'm Bill Browder, my friend and fellow campaigner on sanctions and so on, also believes that Putin's fundamentally motivated by money. But I just disagree with that. I think there is an ideological component, whether it's a mixture of nostalgia for the Tsarism, for Soviet nostalgia, whatever else you want to call it. The other thing is, I think that, yes, I appreciate what you say about the geographical imperative. I remember another big European country which fought one war because they wanted a Platz in der Sonne, place in the sun, because they felt they didn't have any colonies, and that was unfair. And then they fought another war because they wanted something called Lebensraum, because they thought that their geographical national borders were too small. Countries believe all sorts of things, but I appreciate you're not making a normative argument about this, and maybe Russians do want this. That doesn't mean they should have it. Any Poles here in the room? Your only natural frontier runs through the middle of your country, which is the Vistula, and you've got one at the south that defends you very well from the Slovaks if they wanted to attack you. But this, there's lots of countries that don't have natural frontiers, and that's why we have international security arrangements, and we have a World Trading Order, and we have all sorts of other ways so that we can all rub along. And my answer to the Russians who worry about their titanium supplies would be to say, make sure you have absolutely excellent relations with Ukraine, and then you'll have no problem.
Erik, actually, the famous saying of the very same Putin that mочить в сортире, you remember that. It was the beginning, the Chechen Second War and so on.
Rub them out in the shithouse.
Yeah, but doesn't it look like not exactly the transcription of greatness perception of normal way? And in Russia, greatness means different thing than the greatness in our common understanding, isn't it so? Can you see it from your research?
Well, first of all, everybody knows that it's very difficult to do analysis from a distance, and American psychiatry prohibits medical doctors to do this analysis. But since I'm a psychologist, we can do that. So in a way, and certainly, by the way, vocabulary also matters, because the word greatness has many meanings in Russian language and Ukrainian in English. Just compare, sometimes you find lots of incompatible things about it. What is interesting about Putin, and it's not a secret, that's again, as a child, I grew up in the former Soviet Union. I was born on the same island with Putin. I lived in the same neighborhood where he lived. I went to the same school. And basically, well, I think I have to understand the mentality. And all this talks about he was a thug, he was a hooligan, it's just nonsense, because there were no hooligans, no tough people there. Basically, he was just normal teenager like everybody else. So I don't buy this argument, oh yeah, he grew up in a rough neighborhood, just he has this mentality of a tough guy, and he studied wrestling and stuff. Maybe, well, just personality matters. However, don't forget also our personalities are molded, yes, in our childhood, but mostly formative years, late teens, early 20s. And he went to school of law, the most profoundly dogmatic school that would educate snitches, basically. I know this from inside out. So you're trained there in law school, not only just to know the law, but basically that just how to betray, how to find, how to spy on people, how to make them confess, how to trick them. That's the core of the education. And that's perhaps, and well, that was a contributor to his personality, and then KGB school, and then the lawlessness of the 1990s.
But we're still speaking about Putin, but Putin was just a symptom. That's the problem. It's just a symptom, personalized. But we are talking about the Russian fundamental framework, which is much different. And actually, I think that even leaving it doesn't mean very much, just rhetorics maybe in the best case.
Yes and no. And returning to Mike McFall's comments and also Margaret Macmillan, Oxford scholar, who suggested, well, basically it's unknown. Just what if Woodrow Wilson didn't campaign well and he was become president of the United States? Would the United States enter World War I? What if Nixon screwed up a little bit and he lost in 1968? What if Al Gore, basically just unlucky, just he won elections in 2000, so will we have George Bush? What ifs just around his, just that's exactly, who knows? And I'm convinced, yes, Putin is a symptom. We had a different guy in charge, and Russians will just follow just in a lockstep. So we have a more democratic guy, maybe oxymoron, right, in Russia. But he or she, hopefully, just coming there, talking sense, and Russia would turn that color. We've seen that movie many times before. Whatever they say there, who am I? That's a deal between the government and people. I will guarantee your salaries and just your pension funds and everything else. Roads will be paved. Don't mess with politics. Basically, that's so. Yes, Putin is a symptom, but also he's a cause. That's why we say there is no Putin, there is no cause, and history will change.
Sorry, but we actually had problems in the 1990s. Yeah, even when the West was falling in love with Gorbachev and Yeltsin, people here saw it very differently, and they were right to see it differently. So I'm very cautious about personalizing it on Putin, but I also think that we shouldn't say that Putin's rise to power marked a sort of massive inflection point. There'll be many inflection points, but you could go back to the role of Korzhakov as Yeltsin's chief of bodyguards. You could go back to Primakov's role as the continuity SVR. You could go back to the way in which the GRU never really changed. There's been all sorts of things that haven't changed. We thought things had changed because the West wasn't looking properly.
Well, thank you very much. Well, it's very interesting. But well, I am worried a little bit about Edward. He will miss you will miss your plane.
They'll keep it.
We need.
But we move to the questions and answers.
Yeah. Please, Mike. Give it here, yeah.
This has been great, and I have lots of comments that I'm not going to make about structures versus agents in Russia. But let's talk about that during coffee. But I want to hear more about Ukrainian society. We spent a lot of time talking about Russia. Tim, you said a little bit about you had a hypothesis about the future of Ukrainian democracy, society as a result of the war. Can I hear, does everybody agree? Because you painted a pretty pessimistic picture about the
it's
future.
It's not as bad as it could be, and it's not going to be as good as it could be.
Well, I heard your view. I want to hear from other people. Do you agree with him that it says, I thought it was pretty pessimistic. I have a very different view, and I wanted to hear from others. Let's hear about Ukrainian society after this horrific.
Jason, you are working in Ukraine also.
I think that if you look at the polling they've done in the past year or 2 years, and you look at shifts of what people believe versus the pre-war period, the last poll that I did in Ukraine in 2021, it was December, I think, we asked what foreign leader do you think would be the best model for Ukraine, and Lukashenko was in first place. So today he's not in first place. That's positive. But there is something that did shift, which is that there is less of people saying things that they which would generally be considered openness questions. You know, what do you think about signing petitions? What do you think about going to protest? Now, that's probably indicative of the fact that there's a war, so people are more conservative. I'm actually generally more optimistic, not pessimistic, because despite that, because that's often cited when you talk to people in Ukraine, they say it's getting worse, and they look at these numbers. I don't agree, because I think that's changed because you see something different, is when the war does conclude, who is most likely to come to power? If you look at the leading people in all the polling, there's Zaluzhny and followed by Budanov. And given the fact that they're both military and both their backgrounds, their reputations, you look at the focus group findings, what they like about them. One of the things is they're considered to be honest. They're not considered to be corrupt. And the fact that they have a reputation for that, Ukraine's always, as you well enough know, struggled with a few different forms of corruption, with the role of the oligarchy in Ukraine, which is significantly different than Russia. But if you look at the role of that there, it would seem that whoever comes to power would be able to reset that. And it's been unable to reset that throughout the 1990s till today. It's been the same faces there the whole time. And as they've been able to, within themselves, control the TV stations, control all the power, nothing changes. But if that does change, I think, yeah, it really could happen.
Ed.
I may have sounded pessimistic, so I was just pointing the both post-war countries, when we get post-war, suffer from trauma. But I think Ukraine is completely different in that you've got there may be a lot of institution building still needed, but there's a huge appetite in Ukraine to live in a democratic, free country. I don't meet any Ukrainians who say, I would like to have a sort of, post-war military dictatorship. No. And I think insofar as there's disillusionment with the West, that's actually quite healthy, because one of the things that bothered me about Ukraine and some other countries as well was this kind of cargo cult idea that if only we could get this nirvana of EU and NATO membership, then everything will be all right. And I think that in Georgia, Misha Saakashvili perhaps exemplified this idea of you always parade around in front of EU and NATO flags, and somehow that's just going to make everything magic, and there are no shortcuts. And I think that the impatience, and actually it's a little bit like Estonians, I think saw this very clearly when they realised that in many ways they were ahead of the EU, and this innate self-confidence that you have here when it comes to good government, digital stuff, and so on. Transparency. Don't let yourself be dragged down to kind of EU standards. I think I'm beginning to notice a bit of that in Ukraine. They say we have a really serious defence industry. We don't need subsidies. We have globally competitive products. Everyone's banging our doors down. We now have the very nice problem of, do we supply our own armed forces first, or do the very lucrative? So I'm basically extremely optimistic, but I think it's going to be very bumpy 5 to 10 years while these things work themselves out.
Definitely. President Ilves.
Just several comments. First of all, just a minor point to Edward, when you mentioned like Gorbamania and other things. I actually go back to about 1935 when William Bullitt wrote a cable to the United States, to the State Department, saying that we have to support Stalin because otherwise the hardliners will take over. Which you know about that, right? I mean, it was like... Okay, one of the things that sort of runs through this and a lot of discussions is I would say the anti-empiricist bias of Western Europe and the United States regarding people who have actually experienced Russia. This is best exemplified by a quote from former Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, asked about whether Kaja Kallas should be the next NATO Secretary General, to which he said, Kaja Kallas is very smart and very competent, but we cannot have a SecGen that comes from a country bordering Russia, which he said at a time when the only person who had ever been SecGen for 2 consecutive terms was from Norway. And that kind of shows this mentality that, oh, those Eastern Europeans over there. On this, when we talk about, Kaja Kallas actually is the daughter of the youngest person deported from Estonia in the mass deportations of 1949. People have experience. And it goes much further than that. I won't mention his name, but there is a tech bro here who is very, very successful and was constantly dealing with, arguing that, come on, let's be nice to Russia, It's like, this is before 22. In March 2022, he called me up and he said, okay, I get it. And this was right after Bucha. His great-grandfather had been machine gunned to death simply because he was his great-grandfather had been a village councillor. But in the island of Saaremaa, they lined up 140 people who were in, village councils and shot them all. These things don't go away. And so the experience is here. The experience is less and less direct, more and more coming through families. But in this country, in a survey done in the late 90s, 65% of the Estonians had knew someone or was related to someone who had either been shot, deported, or fled to the West. And this repeats. I mean, I'm sure in Poland it's even higher. So these countries all have direct experience with what Russia can do. And Russia, it's not simply that the West has attacked Russia. I mean, our experience here actually is with Ivan Grozny. There was no West attacking Russia. It was Ivan Grozny who butchered this entire region in the 16th century. And ever since then, we've been kind of worried about what comes from the East. And that's true of all of these countries here. So they have experience. Now, on the issue of sort of Russians being afraid of the West because they're always attacked, is that an overall Russian response, or is that kind of an excuse for the leadership to pursue its current behavior?
Thomas, it has been taught in the General Staff Academy and in the Institute of Foreign Services during the Soviet time, during Yeltsin time, and even now. All the same handbooks, just some terminology change.
No, I agree, but my question is this just a case of brainwashing? I mean, is there a reality to this? If you look at the behavior of the past 30 years, it's been kind of the opposite. It has been, I mean, from 1989 to basically 2022, the whole attitude is that we have to be nice to Russia. You know, Russia, Al Gore, Russia had too much shock and too little therapy when what they did in Russia was nothing compared to what Eastern Europeans did, nothing compared to it. And so I would just say that I think you will find that East Europeans across the board, or at least through to Poland from here, don't have much sympathy with, oh, we have to understand them. We don't. We have to defend ourselves against them. And the fact that this is a line about, well, the Estonians are like arming themselves. I mean, let's be serious. Are the Estonians really going to do a pincer movement on St. Petersburg together with the Finns? I doubt it.
Sorry, I have to summarize here. I think that one point hasn't been very much touched, except Jason did it, because there is a substantial portion of Russian, not only elite, but also other stratas of Russian society who are benefiting from the war. That's the tragedy. For provincial Russia, even this mercenary system is very beneficial. And therefore, I think that even ending this war, for example, and even having some kind of settlement, whatever kind of Korean type of settlement or whatever, still there will be a lot of people who will first try to continue one way or another benefiting, and in case they can't, they will be dissatisfied. They will have next PTCD. So basically, this is a very, very dangerous mindset which we are witnessing. And there was a report as a conclusion. There was a report of Academy of Internal Security, Estonian Academy.
They call it the Academy of Security Sciences.
Sciences, okay.
They want these fancy names.
Yeah, but they are educating all the people related to security one way or another. And this report was claiming 4 basic scenarios for further development of Russia after the war. And actually, all of them were not very beneficial. And out of those 4, only one was more or less suitable from the perspective of a small country like Estonia, border country. And this one was democratization of Russia, which they claimed to be the less possible scenario. All other 3, even breakdown of Russian statehood, whatever other they were, all of them being still a jeopardy for us here. So when we hear that from the ally side that, okay, you are too biased and you should be more collaborative and so on, what President Ilves said about this wave of let's be friends, which was repeating itself each and every 10 years in the West. So this is something which we cannot afford. We just cannot afford. And it's not about democracy. Even in case of democratic overall development, some kind of in Russian case, still there will be a jeopardy for us continuously. And that's a tragedy, because then we are differently positioned than majority of the West. Sorry to say that, not mentioning the US. But last question. Okay, ladies haven't had last ladies first, but ladies last now. Sorry.
Much appreciated. I look into the future. Let's say that the war ends tomorrow, for the argument's sake. To what President Ilves just said, maybe last time we weren't harsh enough and we were too nice to Russia. What do we do now? Are we mean to Russia? Do we cut them off and isolate them after the war? Do we reintroduce them into the economic and political system? What works? What do we know doesn't work? And where do we go from here then?
Okay, Jason, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I think that fundamentally, if you think that it's just because they have an ideology, then you should cut them off. But I don't think it's an ideology. I think that's an excuse. That's a pretense. I mean, if they really believe that ideology, they've embezzled enough money, they could have taken Ukraine. They could have defeated Ukraine, but they embezzled the money. So they had a choice. They could have realized that ideology, but they chose not to. They chose self-enrichment. So I think that going ahead, it's most important is I would focus on the things that we can quantify. We know exactly what they've done. We can quantify how things have changed in their society or changed with this. So I think it would be important to say, going forward, how do we prevent a system like the one that exists today from being able to redevelop or to rebuild itself? And what's necessary to, if it does become reintegrated somehow to the West, to make sure it can never become like it is today. Today is a disaster. I mean, and it was something that allowed to develop. It was allowed to develop over 3 decades.
Eric?
To answer your question, I quite frequently asked this simple question with different variations, like, why don't you have a Swan Lake in Washington, D.C., the ballet, and in New York, basically, Tchaikovsky is not responsible for the war. And my answer is just basically, and I'm asking, do you think that will be okay to play Wagner in London in 1940? Well, yes, there will be changes, institutional, political. However, the resentment, the disapproval, the hatred of Russia and everything Russian will remain in Ukraine for many years. Maybe I'm pessimistic, but I think it's reality that for years to come. People do change their minds, and I hope they do. And people change their minds sometimes for the better. Agree with me? Well, Martin Luther is the best example, unless you're Catholic.
Thank you. Tim?
I'm going to be a typical academic and attack the premise in your question, because I don't actually see the war ending. I can foresee the fighting ending, but the war will continue by other means, political means, and it will be one of the themes of the next 20 or 30 years at least.
Fully agree. What about you, Ed?
I mean, war crimes trials and reparations would be the beginning of a precondition for any normal relation. I think actually what's going to happen is you're going to have the Ukrainians hunting down and killing war criminals anyway. And for the next 20 or 30 years, every Russian who's responsible for rape, torture, murder and destruction is a dead man walking, or occasionally a dead woman walking, whether they're walking the streets of Russia or anywhere else. And we see the Israelis do this after the war. We saw the Armenians do it a bit against the Turks. We saw Croats do it against Yugoslavs. We're going to have to work out what we think about that. Are we going to call that terrorism, or are we going to call that justified retribution? I don't know.
On this optimistic note, we will conclude our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Raivo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, this will be the last panel, just keeps it scheduled because some people have to leave, so I have to also follow that everything works here. So that thank all of those who are still here. So at the last panel will take place. Yes, please take your seats. We have to survive just one panel more. Well, unfortunately, the last panel I have to start with some sad memories from the last year. This is my friend, my colleague, Tanel Kerikmäe has left us too early. So he knew about this actually already, that we have this conference this year, and he was certainly, he's participating. But well, sometimes, yeah, happens some unexpected events. And first I would like to give a floor to my another friend. Well, it's a lot of TalTech people here in this last panel, is Archil Chochia, who is a director, and let's say is the next guy after Tanel to lead the law school, and he's also senior researcher. Well, it's in our law school, and well, I just briefly introduce Panelists as well, which is moderated by my another colleague, which is, we have female representatives in the last panel at least. This is Katrin Nyman-Metcalf, who is a adjunct professor of law. He's also a good friend, colleague, also related with now is a different countries. He's actually originated from Sweden, even he has his Estonian heritage as well, but her PhD is from Uppsala. So, and some panelists are, besides Archil, also Charles Szymanski. We met, I think, Tanel introduced us. So first we met in Vilnius, I think, a long time ago, I think, already. And we also participated in this wonderful talents meeting organized by University of Syracuse just last month in Joensuu, here north of us. And he's actually professor at the University of Bialystok in Poland, and also representing different nations. So originally, of course, he's also American and also distinguished fellow at National Security Law and Policy at the University of Syracuse, New York State. And last but not the least, we have Agnes Kasper, another, let's say, old colleague of mine, which goes, she's also head of the law branch at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence here in Tallinn, but at the same time, she is also a senior lecturer of law and technology. So let's say all also have these double representatives. They are representatives of Estonia, but Agnes also represents Hungary and Archil represents Chochia, so it will become also more international here, not so American anymore. And please, the floor is yours. So let's start with Archil.
Thank you, Holger. Hello, everyone. Just to say a few words about Professor Tanel Kerikmäe, who was the director of our law school, who was the founder of our law school roughly 20 years ago. And Estonian legal education is so that all the lawyers come from Tartu University Law School. That is the biggest law school in the country, was the only law school for a long period of time. And Tanel studied there, worked there, then he studied in Finland. And then he created our law school that had a bit of a different direction. Tanel was really a visionary. Together with Professor Katrin Nyman-Metcalf, they thought about Estonia as the best case and the front runner when it comes to digitalization that needs also specific type of lawyers and specific maybe type of law school that will produce the lawyers who understand technology. So-called T-shaped lawyers who know the law, they're trained as lawyers, but they understand also technology, and they can regulate technology in the right way. So not over-regulated, but also not under-regulated, and this kind of new type of lawyers. And we have been doing it for years now, very successfully. And Tanel has always been our director, but also like a biggest motivator, a friend, colleague, and very, very well known here in Estonia, but also all over the world. And he sadly passed away last August. And yes, and this panel is in memoriam of Professor Tanel Kerikmäe. Thank you.
Thank you, Archil. Yes, we all miss Tanel as a colleague and as a good friend, and it's an honor to moderate this panel in his memory. This is a panel about law, those of us who work with international law rather than just international relations more generally, we have a kind of a funny advantage in this day of the failure of the rule of law, because we've always had to defend international law. There's always been people, not just populists, who say international law is not real law, it doesn't work, it's not effective, it doesn't even exist. And of course, the reason for that is that people compare with national law. They compare with traditional national legal systems where there are clear divisions of competence. We have a legislature with a clear mandate. We have somebody to enforce the laws, to monitor them. We've never had that in international law. It's always been a system created by states, and then the states have to monitor what goes on. They have to enforce, and it's always been sort of a different animal. So in a sense, as I say, we already know we keep having to defend our area because it does exist and it does have a role. However, of course, we are also feeling very much the challenges of today and the challenges that have been mentioned during these interesting discussions. Geopolitics, obviously very important, but also, and I'm glad it's been mentioned several times, technology. It's also challenging a lot of what's going on in the international law sphere. The way we're going to do this panel is that I will pose separate questions to the participants, and I will quickly mention all of those questions, and then they are given, I'm a ruthless timekeeper, they are given maximum 7 minutes each to give their interventions, and then they can comment a bit on one another if they like, so we have time for discussion as well. And the questions, which I will just briefly mention and I'll come back to them, is just that I wanted to mention them because I want to tie them to what's actually already been said today to show that we are this nice whole of this, like a whole, not a whole as something empty, but actually a WHOLE, which is a picture consistent with what's been said in different contexts. So I'm going to ask Agnes first, but not yet, hold on a second, if there is or should be an international legal order in cyberspace. And to this, I'd like to tie to a comment made by President Ilves in the very first panel, where he talked about how the powerful tech bros don't care about the rule of law. And this is one way of like a challenge for what is going on in cyberspace, where so much of our lives now go on. Then I'm going to move to Charles and ask him if there's anything left of the very important role of international law, that it's something, okay, it's the system between states, but it's also something where individuals could protect their rights, because that's one of the real beauties of international legal order, that you can turn also against your own state to different international organs. And here I thought it was interesting that Professor Livingston was mentioning all kinds of challenges where AI and other technologies also lead to sort of a question of what is really the what can be a positive use of the new technologies in the new world, and also for protection of rights. So I don't mean you have to talk about exactly that, but I just thought it was an interesting point in what we should have more opportunities to protect our rights, but maybe that's not the case. And then I come to Archil. Already mentioned that although well established in Estonia for a long time with roots in Georgia, which of course you don't have to talk about Georgia, but I'm afraid as your topic is going to be what civil society's role can be, where we also had questions on this earlier today, that it's sadly quite interesting to talk about Georgia. And here I was thinking about what Professor Diamond was talking about, of this crushing of NGOs and dismantling of democracy. If civil society, and we also had an interesting question of that from my good friend Malela, about what is the role of civil society. So this is all to perhaps show, especially those of you who are not lawyers, that it's not going to be boring at all. So, Agnes, is there or should there be an international legal order in cyberspace?
Okay, thank you very much, Katrin. So good afternoon, everybody. It's both an honor and thus an emotional occasion for me to be here and participating in this roundtable dedicated to the memory of Professor Tanel Kerikmäe. I had the privilege of knowing Tanel for nearly 20 years. He was my PhD supervisor, and so one of the most influential persons in my professional life. He challenged and encouraged me, and he taught me that academic excellence goes hand in hand with generosity and curiosity. I would not be here with you without his guidance. So turning to the question, could there be an international legal order in cyberspace? So I say, there is no separate legal order in cyberspace. States use digital technologies, but international law regulates states' conduct regardless of the means employed. Technology is a tool for state conduct. The real question is, rather, how international law applies in the cyber context. I observe here two opposite forces simultaneously acting. In this field, we have witnessed remarkable progress over the past decade, but technology also brings significant structural stresses. Today, more than 37 states have published individual national positions on the application of international law to cyber activities, alongside with two common positions by the African Union and the European Union. Taken together, these represent well over 100 states expressing views on these issues. This level of engagement would have been difficult to imagine only 3 years ago even. Coming to my second, and more difficult point, cyberspace also exposes one of the greatest practical challenges for international law. The law remains largely stable, while ontological and evidentiary environment in which it operates has changed profoundly. The difficulty is often not that the applicable legal rules are inadequate or obsolete. Rather, the challenge lies in making the relevant facts visible and perceptible. Questions of attribution, proof, intent, scale of effects, state involvement becomes significantly more difficult when evidence is incomplete, technically complex, or deliberately concealed. Our international law has always grappled with uncertainty and incomplete information. Cyberspace magnifies those long-standing difficulties. Artificial intelligence further compounds these challenges, but it does not fundamentally alter the legal principles governing state conduct. It amplifies and intensifies existing problems. Cyber and AI technologies inflict structural pressures rather than legal ruptures on international law. We observe key structural strains by asking the questions what, where, when, who, why, and how concerning when legally relevant decisions occur due to the temporal redistribution of legal risk. What decision makers know and how they know it, where legal risk resides, who bears responsibility, how legal governance adapts to the changes. Resilience of international law is conditional on the responses to these questions, maintaining intelligible decision pathways, accountable human oversight, transparent system design, and institutional mechanisms capable of monitoring and correcting error. Before embarking on ambitious legal reform, states and institutions should exhaust the adaptive capacity of existing mechanisms. This points to recalibration rather than reinvention of international law. Preserving the effectiveness and legitimacy of international law will depend on the continued capacity of legal frameworks to guide reasonable human judgment. If I may conclude with a thought that also reflects Tanel's legacy. Throughout his career, he encouraged us to embrace technological change without abandoning legal principles. The future of international legal order will not depend on inventing entirely new legal systems for every emerging technology. It will depend on our ability to interpret, apply, operationalize, and where necessary, develop international law with intellectual rigor, practical wisdom, and openness to dialogue. I believe Tanel would have appreciated that approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll come back to questions and tie together our slightly different questions in a minute. But Charles, is there anything left of this idea that the international legal order is something that individuals can use to protect their rights? Or is this something that's being thrown out when the rule of law is challenged generally?
Yeah, international law, I think generally, as you pointed out, has taken a lot of hits, especially with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You know, either people are up in arms that it doesn't exist, or why aren't they following it? You know, academics may seem like their heads are in the clouds. I mean, that's a view. I have obviously believe in international law, but the public perception is somewhat different. And in addition to on issues of security, which we've talked a lot about today, you mentioned individual rights, and I think that's your question to me. What challenges does AI pose, and does international law have an answer to kind of protect individual international law rights in the age of artificial intelligence? There are many challenges, and I think a number of our speakers talked about them in different contexts this morning. Obviously, with privacy and data protection, I was at a conference, ages ago, I think in Lithuania, in Klaipėda, and there was one speaker, again, and this was like, 10 years ago. Could you imagine in the 1980s, and there were some references to 1980s television this morning, but that you would be filmed everywhere you went, elevators, streets, cameras, on your computer, all your data being uploaded. And I think if you ask the average 1985 citizen, or 1984, that's even better, they would be shocked by that, really. And it just has happened gradually. And now, even with data protection rules, everybody clicks on, I agree, I accept all cookies, upload all my data. I mean, maybe this audience doesn't, but I think most people do. And it just become ingrained in us. So data protection, privacy rights, especially with facial recognition, what artificial intelligence could do there, that violates some basic international human rights principles, or at least raises issues there. Intellectual property, right, and in terms of music, works of literature being uploaded by the various AI services, that also does violate human rights, potentially. We'll see how that progresses through the courts. Discrimination, an issue that I've looked at a lot and researched. With discrimination, sometimes it's not so obvious. There was some, I think one of the best anecdotes was about advertisements for truck driving positions placed on Google. So I have a trucking company, Archil and I. We don't have a trucking company yet, but if we did, yeah, we would post an ad maybe on Google to recruit people, and the algorithm posts it to primarily what gender? Yeah, it's something like 87%. Again, and Google would say, no, we're not intentionally discriminating. Why would 87% of the recipients of this advertisement be men? Because? Yeah, I mean, bias, but most truck drivers are men, traditionally, so the algorithm reinforces that and only sends it, mostly sent, 87% targets it towards men. Now, obviously that creates some problems. You don't know that you missed the advertisement, right? If you're a woman, I didn't see it, so I don't know I was discriminated against, right? But it also reinforces whatever sex stereotype existed, right? That traditionally truck drivers are men, they could only be men, but that's shutting out interested women who might want to become truck drivers. So discrimination, and this, hopefully be able to tie this together, you don't necessarily even know you're being discriminated against, but the algorithm is doing that, and then, what kind of international legal rights might intervene at that point. Other algorithms, especially also related to work, there's one example of a recruitment algorithm where if you uploaded your resume or CV by the existing browser that you had, you were deleted. You didn't advance further, you didn't get an interview. If you had changed your browser, for example, to Chrome, then it would progress you to the next step, maybe to an interview, maybe to the job. Why would the algorithm do that besides just something randomly? Because if you changed your browser, what does that suggest about you? It suggests that you might be innovative. You're not satisfied with the status quo. You wanted to change something, and even if Chrome is not better, you did that. You made an upgrade, and who might that discriminate against? If you think about it. So that's interesting, right? We want go-getters, right? People not satisfied with the status quo. That sounds reasonable, but maybe older people stick with the browser that they have on their computer, right? Some disabled people, there are certain programs from Microsoft Edge, certain browsers are geared toward disabled people. So it might not have been that you're not innovative, but you might have stuck with that browser for particular reasons. So those are issues of discrimination. Due process, the right to a trial, to the extent courts use AI in writing decisions, right? Does that satisfy your right to a fair trial or right to access to the court? Right to life in terms of international humanitarian law, algorithms that do, especially was used in Gaza, do we hit a hospital where Hamas is based? And the algorithm would do analysis. Well, how many people are we going to kill? How many civilians? Normally, that usually was done by international lawyers, and they would do an analysis. Now the algorithm does that. Is that safely protecting the right to life? Well, what does international law say about that? There are, major international human rights conventions on political and civil rights and social and economic rights, but they're really soft law instruments. As we talked about, there's not a mechanism that they could be directly enforced. There's an optional protocol, but it's not so effectively as hard law enforcing those rights. And I think with soft law, the problem, and some of the speakers mentioned to it earlier this morning, AI is moving too fast. Soft law was based that eventually Saudi Arabia, China, they signed the human rights conventions. Eventually, they'll begin to turn soft law into hard law. That maybe necessarily hasn't even happened, but with AI, it's running too fast, and maybe we can't wait any longer. Hard law, there is some hard law with the European Convention of Human Rights. There are judgments, there are penalties, European law with the AI regulation. So there have been regional attempts at regulating maybe the excesses of AI. And there's a new framework convention in AI with the Council of Europe that's open for ratification. A few countries have ratified it. But it's in Europe, basically. So what are the weaknesses of that? Well, we talked about, I think Mike had raised earlier about maybe over-regulating AI. And one criticism of Europe, even though we want to protect these individual rights, is that China and the US are not, and they're advancing. And where are all the AI companies? They're in Silicon Valley, they're in the US or China, right? And Europe is not having a capacity to compete in that area. So, yeah, we could protect all these rights, but then we outsource this kind of this industry of the future, right? Technology. Can you do that? Even if you did, there's problems perhaps with enforceability. That was the purpose of these discrimination examples. We don't know how AI is affecting our human rights, not all the time, or it just it goes under the radar. I talked about competitiveness, and also even where AI regulation exists, there's often national security exceptions. So, for the security of the state in a time of war and threat, even if there is protections for human rights, there are rather wide exceptions as to what national security means. What's the hope, if there is hope? As I was asked before this presentation, I think there might be in the area of employment and work. There's been some interesting decisions by Chinese courts protecting employees who have been displaced by AI. This could be a common ground. If the scenario that AI will come for us, even the professors, the intellectuals, not like globalization where it was blue-collar workers, If it's a situation where 70% of jobs are displaced, if that scenario is realized, I think the world does have a common issue in reacting to that and creating some international instruments that prevent the excesses of that. And there are some solutions that have been proposed. I think that could be true. The other hope, I think, it may be less likely. China has some issues, obviously, now with the free trade model, basically the American model that was raised earlier. China is a huge exporter, and that these trade imbalances have not subsided. Maybe some hope to tie free trade under the old American system. China would get the benefits of that if they accept a human rights package. In other words, kind of the old like Helsinki Final Act in the 70s, it was like baskets of security, free trade, and human rights. If China could come on board accepting those three things, including a human rights mechanism that included recognition, regulation of AI, I think that might be a hope for the future for international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of interesting points.